The smoky atmosphere of Murphy's tavern hung heavy in the air as Sarah Mitchell sat alone at the far end of the wooden bar, nursing a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid caught the dim light from the overhead lamps, creating small golden reflections that danced across her weathered hands. At 42, Sarah carried herself with a quiet dignity that most people mistook for meekness. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, a plain navy sweater, and dark jeans that gave no hint of her true profession. The tavern was a popular hangout spot for military personnel from nearby base, and tonight was no exception. Groups of young soldiers and Marines filled the wooden tables, their voices growing louder with each round of drinks. Sarah had chosen this particular establishment specifically because it was frequented by her own troops, though none of them recognized her out of uniform. She made it a habit to observe her soldiers in their natural environment, understanding that leadership required knowing the people under her command beyond their professional facade. As she took another sip of her whiskey, Sarah's attention was drawn to a table of 5 Marines who had been growing increasingly rowdy throughout the evening. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, a stocky man with a thick Brooklyn accent, was holding court with his usual bravado. Corporal Jake Williams, barely 21 with his fresh-faced appearance and cocky grin, hung on every word. Sergeant Lisa Chun sat beside them, her laughter sharp and cutting as she joined in their conversations. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez nodded along enthusiastically, eager to fit in with the more experienced Marines. And, finally, Lance Corporal Kevin Murphy, no relation to the bar's owner, rounded out the group with his constant need to prove himself through increasingly outrageous stories. Sarah had been observing them for the better part of an hour, making mental notes about their behavior and group dynamics. She recognized the type, young, ambitious, and full of the kind of swagger that came from surviving basic training and feeling invincible. What concerned her was the underlying current of disrespect and entitlement that seemed to permeate their conversations. They spoke dismissively about their superiors, complained loudly about military protocols, and showed a general lack of the discipline and respect that should define professional Marines. The evening had started innocently enough. Sarah had arrived at Murphy's Tavern around 7 in the evening, seeking a quiet place to unwind after a particularly challenging day of strategic planning meetings at the Pentagon. As the commanding general of the Marine Expeditionary Force, her days were filled with briefings, budget discussions, and the weight of decisions that could affect thousands of lives. Sometimes she needed to step away from the stars on her uniform and simply be Sarah Mitchell, a woman who enjoyed a good whiskey and the simple pleasure of people watching. She had specifically chosen a seat at the bar rather than a table, positioning herself where she could observe without drawing attention. The bartender, a gruff older man named Pete who had served in Vietnam, occasionally made small talk, but mostly left her alone. Sarah appreciated his understanding of when someone needed solitude versus conversation. She had been coming to Murphy's sporadically for the past 6 months, always in civilian clothes, always keeping to herself. The group of Marines had arrived around 8:30, their voices immediately distinguishable from the general din of the tavern. Sarah recognized them not by their faces, which was understandable given the size of her command, but by their unit patches and the way they carried themselves. They were from the 2nd Battalion, a unit she had been monitoring closely due to some concerning reports about morale and discipline issues. As the evening progressed, their conversation topics shifted from harmless reminiscing about training exercises to more troubling territory. They began discussing their female colleagues with crude language and dismissive attitudes. Staff Sergeant Torres seemed to be the ringleader, regaling the table with stories that painted women in the military as either incompetent or present solely for the entertainment of their male counterparts. "You know what kills me about these diversity initiatives?" Torres said, his voice carrying clearly across the tavern. "They're putting women in positions they can't handle just to make some politician happy. I've seen it over and over. Some female officer gets promoted way beyond her capabilities, and then real Marines have to clean up the mess." Corporal Williams nodded enthusiastically, adding his own commentary. "Remember that lieutenant colonel we had last year? She couldn't even do a proper push-up, but somehow she was supposed to be leading combat operations. It's a joke." Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she listened, but she maintained her calm exterior. This was exactly the kind of toxic attitude that created problems throughout the chain of command. She had dealt with similar situations before, but hearing it firsthand in this informal setting provided valuable insight into the depth of the problem. Sergeant Chen's participation in the conversation was particularly disappointing to Sarah. As one of the few women at the table, her agreement with the sexist commentary suggested that the toxic culture had infected even those who should have known better. "I hate to say it, but they're right," Chen said with a shrug. "Half the women I've served with use their gender as an excuse when things get tough. It makes it harder for those of us who actually want to do the job." Private Rodriguez, eager to impress his superiors, jumped in with his own story. "My drill instructor always said that the military went soft when they started letting women in combat roles. He said it was just a matter of time before some female general would get a bunch of good Marines killed because she was too emotional to make the hard decisions." Lance Corporal Murphy laughed loudly at this, slapping Rodriguez on the back. "Can you imagine taking orders from some woman general? I'd probably laugh in her face. What you gonna do, cry about it?" The comment sent the entire table into fits of laughter, their voices growing even louder and more disrespectful. Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, but years of military discipline had taught her to channel such emotions productively. She was gathering intelligence now, learning about the attitudes and beliefs that were undermining unit cohesion and effectiveness. As the evening continued, the Marines' conversation became increasingly inappropriate. They shared stories about undermining female superiors, discussed ways to make women in their unit feel unwelcome, and generally demonstrated the kind of behavior that Sarah had been working to eliminate from her command. Each comment felt like a personal attack, not just because she was a woman, but because she was their commanding general, the very person they were unknowingly insulting. The irony of the situation was not lost on Sarah. Here she sat, a 3-star general with over 20 years of distinguished service, listening to her own Marines dismiss the possibility that a woman could effectively lead them. She had earned her position through exceptional performance in combat zones, strategic brilliance that had saved countless lives, and a dedication to her Marines that had cost her 2 marriages and countless personal sacrifices. Sarah's military career had been marked by a series of firsts. She was the first woman to lead a combat unit in her particular specialty, the first female general in her family's long military tradition, and the first person of any gender to successfully implement certain strategic innovations that had become standard practice throughout the Marine Corps. Her record was spotless, her decorations numerous, and her reputation among senior leadership was exemplary. Yet none of that mattered to the young Marines sitting 20 feet away from her. To them, she was invisible, just another middle-aged woman taking up space in their domain. The casual dismissal hurt more than she cared to admit, not because it was personal, but because it represented a fundamental failure in the values and culture she had worked so hard to instill in her command. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself studying each Marine individually, memorizing their faces, and making mental notes about their personalities and leadership potential. Torres clearly saw himself as the alpha of the group, using humor and bravado to mask what Sarah suspected was deep-seated insecurity about his own capabilities. Williams was young and impressionable, following Torres's lead without much independent thought. Chen's participation troubled Sarah the most, as it suggested that internalized sexism was affecting even the women in her command. Rodriguez and Murphy seemed to be competing for acceptance from their more senior colleagues, each trying to outdo the other with increasingly outrageous statements and stories. This dynamic was particularly concerning to Sarah, as it indicated that the toxic culture was being passed down to newer Marines, ensuring its continuation through future generations. The bartender, Pete, occasionally glanced in the direction of the loud table with obvious disapproval, but he seemed reluctant to intervene as long as they continued ordering drinks and didn't become physically disruptive. Sarah respected his position. Running a business that catered to military personnel required a delicate balance between maintaining order and allowing soldiers to blow off steam. As she sat there, Sarah reflected on the challenges she had faced throughout her career. The military had changed dramatically since she first enlisted as a young private 22 years ago, but clearly not as much as she had hoped. The same attitudes and prejudices that had made her early years so difficult were still present, just better hidden beneath a veneer of official diversity policies and sensitivity training. She thought about the countless meetings she had attended where male colleagues had talked over her, dismissed her ideas, or assumed she was there as a token representative rather than a qualified leader. She remembered the time she had been forced to work twice as hard as her male counterparts just to be considered half as good. The sleepless nights spent preparing for briefings where she knew every word would be scrutinized more harshly because of her gender. But she also remembered the victories, the successful mission she had planned and executed, the young Marines she had mentored who had gone on to distinguished careers of their own, and the gradual changes she had been able to implement throughout her command. Progress was slow and sometimes imperceptible, but it was real. The Marines' laughter brought her back to the present moment. They had moved on to discussing their upcoming deployment, and their conversation had taken on a more serious tone. Despite the earlier comments, Sarah could hear the underlying anxiety and excitement that came with the prospect of active duty. These were still her Marines, regardless of their personal opinions about women in leadership roles. As she finished her whiskey, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would begin implementing some changes in how her command addressed issues of respect and professionalism. She would also make it a point to visit the 2nd Battalion during their next training exercise, though they wouldn't know she had been observing them tonight. The evening was drawing to a close, and the tavern was beginning to empty out. Sarah left a generous tip for Pete and gathered her things, preparing to leave. As she walked past the Marines' table, she caught fragments of their ongoing conversation, still peppered with inappropriate comments and disrespectful attitudes. None of them looked up as she passed, confirming her invisibility in their eyes. Tomorrow, that would change dramatically. Tomorrow, they would learn exactly who had been sitting at the end of the bar, quietly observing their behavior and listening to every word they had spoken. As Sarah stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a mixture of disappointment and determination. The challenges facing her command were larger than she had realized, but she had faced difficult situations before. The key would be addressing the problem in a way that created lasting change, rather than simply punishing individual Marines for attitudes that were clearly widespread. The drive back to her quarters gave her time to process everything she had witnessed and begin formulating a plan. Change would come to her command, one conversation and one Marine at a time if necessary. The young Marines at Murphy's Tavern had no idea that their casual disrespect had just sealed their fate for a very enlightening conversation with their commanding general. Sarah Mitchell had not risen through the ranks by backing down from challenges, and she certainly wasn't going to start now. The harsh fluorescent lights of the 2nd Battalion's administrative building buzzed overhead as Staff Sergeant Torres shuffled through the morning's paperwork. His head throbbed from the previous night's festivities at Murphy's Tavern, and the bitter taste of too much beer still lingered in his mouth. The black coffee in his ceramic mug had long since grown cold, but he continued sipping it mechanically while reviewing training schedules and equipment inventories. The administrative office was typical of military facilities: gray metal desks arranged in precise rows, filing cabinets lined against sterile walls, and the ever-present smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with old coffee. Torres had claimed the desk closest to the window, a small privilege of rank that allowed him to occasionally glance outside at the parade ground where new recruits were already running their morning exercises. Corporal Williams sat 2 desks away, squinting at his computer screen while typing up the previous day's incident reports. His usually perfect military appearance looked slightly disheveled this morning. His uniform shirt wasn't quite as crisp as regulation required, and there were faint dark circles under his eyes that spoke to a night of poor decisions and even worse sleep. The office was unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning. Typically, the administrative staff would be bustling with activity as they prepared for the day's training exercises and briefings. But today felt different somehow. There was an underlying tension that Torres couldn't quite identify, like the calm before a storm that experienced Marines learned to recognize. Sergeant Chun had called in sick, which was unusual for someone with her typically perfect attendance record. Torres suspected she was nursing a hangover similar to his own, though she would never admit to such weakness. Her absence meant that several of her routine tasks had fallen to the junior Marines, creating a ripple effect of delayed paperwork and rescheduled appointments. Private Rodriguez and Lance Corporal Murphy were conspicuously focused on their work, avoiding the casual conversation that usually filled the morning hours. Both young Marines had seemed particularly enthusiastic about their jokes and stories the previous evening, but now they appeared subdued and slightly nervous. Torres attributed this to their youth and inexperience with alcohol, though he made a mental note to counsel them about maintaining proper military bearing regardless of personal discomfort. The morning routine proceeded normally despite the collective hangover affecting half the office staff. Torres reviewed the week's training schedule, noting that they had several important exercises planned that would require coordination with other units on the base. The 2nd Battalion had been selected to participate in a joint training exercise with visiting forces from allied nations, an honor that reflected well on their reputation and capabilities. At precisely 9:15, the office phone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for internal military communications. Torres glanced up from his paperwork, expecting Williams to answer, as was typical protocol for junior personnel. However, Williams appeared to be deeply engrossed in his computer work, either genuinely busy or strategically avoiding phone duty. Torres sighed and reached for the phone himself, clearing his throat before speaking in his most professional voice. 2nd Battalion Administration, Staff Sergeant Torres speaking. How may I help you, sir or ma'am? The voice on the other end was crisp and authoritative, belonging to someone clearly accustomed to being obeyed without question. Staff Sergeant Torres, this is Colonel Richardson's office calling on behalf of General Mitchell. The General requires your immediate presence, along with Corporal Williams, Sergeant Chun, Private Rodriguez, and Lance Corporal Murphy, in Conference Room Alpha at 1000 hours sharp. Torres felt his stomach drop as he processed the information. General Mitchell was not a name he recognized from his usual chain of command, which meant this was likely someone from higher up the food chain, possibly much higher. Conference Room Alpha was reserved for the most serious meetings, the kind that could make or break military careers. Roger that, sir. May I inquire about the nature of this meeting? Torres asked, though he suspected the answer would provide little comfort. The General will explain everything during the briefing, Staff Sergeant. Ensure that all requested personnel are present and accounted for. Standard duty uniforms are required, and I suggest you review regulation standards before arrival. The line went dead, leaving Torres staring at the phone with a growing sense of dread. The comment about reviewing regulation standards was particularly ominous. It suggested that their appearance and bearing would be under scrutiny. Combined with the formal nature of the summons, this meeting was clearly not routine administrative business. Williams had stopped typing and was now watching Torres with obvious concern. Everything okay, Staff Sergeant? Torres replaced the phone in its cradle and ran his hand through his short-cropped hair, a nervous habit he had developed during his early military years. We've got a meeting with some General Mitchell at 1000 hours. You, me, Rodriguez, Murphy, and Chin all have to be there. Chin called in sick, Williams reminded him, though his voice suggested he was hoping this might excuse them all from whatever was about to happen. Not anymore, she didn't, Torres replied grimly. You need to call her right now and tell her to get her ass down here. I don't care if she's dying of the plague. When a general summons you, you show up. Williams nodded quickly and began dialing Chin's number while Torres tried to think through what could have prompted such high-level attention. The 2nd Battalion hadn't been involved in any major incidents recently, and their training scores have been within acceptable parameters. There had been some minor disciplinary issues over the past few months, but nothing that would typically warrant attention from general officers. As Williams spoke quietly into the phone, Torres began mentally reviewing the previous evening's activities. They had been loud and perhaps a bit crude in their conversation at Murphy's Tavern, but that was hardly unusual behavior for off-duty Marines. Military personnel have been blowing off steam in similar ways since the beginning of organized warfare. However, a nagging worry began to form in Torres's mind. What if someone had been listening? What if their comments about women in the military had been overheard by someone with the power to cause them serious problems? The thought seemed paranoid, but Torres had survived this long in the military by taking potential threats seriously. Chin's on her way, Williams reported after ending his phone call. She sounded pretty rough, but she'll be here in 20 minutes. Torres nodded and began gathering the other 2 Marines from their respective duty stations around the building. Rodriguez was found in the supply room conducting inventory, his usual enthusiasm noticeably dampened by what Torres assumed was his first serious hangover. Murphy was in the communications office, monitoring radio traffic with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was trying very hard not to think about how his head was pounding. Both Marines accepted the news of their summons with the resigned acceptance typical of military life. When higher-ranking officers wanted to see you, you went, no questions asked, no excuses accepted. However, Torres could see the same worry in their eyes that he felt growing in his own chest. By 9:45, all 5 Marines had assembled in the administrative office, their uniforms hastily corrected to meet regulation standards. Chen had arrived looking pale, but determined, her usually perfect appearance showing only minor signs of her morning's distress. She had managed to clean up remarkably well in the short time available, though Torres could see the effort it was costing her to maintain her professional composure. "Does anyone have any idea what this is about?" Chen asked quietly, voicing the question they were all thinking. Torres shook his head, though his mind kept returning to their conversation at Murphy's Tavern. Could be anything. Maybe they're selecting people for some special assignment, or maybe there's been a complaint about our unit performance. Or maybe someone heard us talking last night, Murphy suggested, immediately regretting his words as all eyes turned to him. The suggestion hung in the air like a dark cloud. None of them wanted to consider the possibility, but it would explain the formal nature of the summons and the emphasis on regulation appearance. Military careers have been ended for far less serious infractions than inappropriate comments about superior officers. "That's ridiculous," Williams said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We were just having some drinks and talking. There's nothing illegal about that." Chen looked troubled. "What exactly did we say last night? I know we were pretty loose with our conversation topics." Torres tried to recall the specific details of their discussion, but the alcohol had blurred many of the specifics. He remembered making comments about women in leadership positions, sharing stories that probably crossed professional boundaries, and generally expressing opinions that would not be well received by senior leadership. The more he thought about it, the more worried he became. "Look, we all said things last night that probably weren't our finest moments," Torres admitted. "But we were off duty in a civilian establishment, having a private conversation. Even if someone overheard us, I can't see how that would warrant this kind of attention." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "My drill instructor always said that a Marine is never really off duty. Maybe we should have been more careful about what we said and where we said it." The comment earned him several sharp looks from his colleagues, but Torres had to admit the young Marine had a point. Military service required a higher standard of conduct, both on and off duty, and they had definitely fallen short of that standard the previous evening. At 9:55, Torres led his small group out of the administrative building and across the base toward the headquarters complex where Conference Room Alpha was located. The morning sun was bright and warm, a stark contrast to the cold dread settling in their stomachs. Other Marines they passed seemed to sense their tension, offering brief nods of acknowledgement, but avoiding conversation. The headquarters building was an imposing structure of red brick and white columns, designed to project the authority and tradition of the Marine Corps. Its hallways were lined with portraits of distinguished officers and displays of historical artifacts that served as constant reminders of the standards expected from every Marine. Conference Room Alpha was located on the second floor, down a corridor lined with offices belonging to senior officers whose decisions affected thousands of lives. As they approached the heavy wooden door, Torres could see his reflection in the polished nameplate, a young staff sergeant who suddenly felt very small and very vulnerable. At exactly 1000 hours, Torres knocked twice on the door and waited for permission to enter. A firm voice from inside called out, "Enter," and the 5 Marines filed into the room with the precise movements drilled into them through years of military training. The conference room was larger than Torres had expected, with a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. Military maps covered the walls, and flags representing various units and allied nations stood at attention in the corners. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a view of the parade grounds below, where Marines continued their morning exercises in perfect formation. At the head of the table sat a woman in her early 40s, wearing the dress blue uniform of a Marine Corps general. 3 stars gleamed on her collar, indicating a rank that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her dark eyes seemed to take in every detail of the 5 Marines standing at attention before her. Torres felt his world shift as recognition dawned. This was the woman from Murphy's Tavern, the quiet civilian who had been sitting alone at the bar while they shared their inappropriate jokes and disrespectful comments. She had heard every word they said, witnessed every laugh, and observed every moment of their unprofessional behavior. General Sarah Mitchell allowed the silence to stretch for several long seconds, her gaze moving from one Marine to another with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to reading people and situations. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Good morning, Marines. Please take a seat." The leather chairs creaked softly as the 5 Marines sat down, their movements stiff and uncertain. Torres could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the air-conditioned comfort of Conference Room Alpha. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sounds of military exercises drifting through the tall windows and the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. General Mitchell remained standing at the head of the table, her hands clasped behind her back in the classic military posture of authority. Her uniform was impeccable, every ribbon perfectly aligned, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every detail speaking to decades of military precision and pride. The 3 stars on her collar caught the morning light streaming through the windows, serving as a constant reminder of the vast gulf in rank and experience between herself and the Marines seated before her. "I'm sure you're all wondering why you've been summoned here this morning," General Mitchell began, her voice calm and measured. "Before we begin, let me introduce myself properly. I am General Sarah Mitchell, Commanding General of the Marine Expeditionary Force. Your chain of command ultimately reports to me, which means that your conduct, your performance, and your adherence to Marine Corps values are my responsibility." Torres felt his mouth go dry. The Marine Expeditionary Force was a massive organization encompassing tens of thousands of Marines across multiple units and installations. To be the commanding general of such a force required not only exceptional military skill, but also the kind of political acumen and strategic thinking that separated the truly elite officers from the merely competent. "Last evening," General Mitchell continued, beginning to pace slowly around the conference table, "I had the opportunity to observe some of my Marines in an off-duty environment. It was quite educational, though not in the way I had hoped." Williams shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Torres could see the young corporal's face beginning to pale as the implications of the general's words became clear. Across the table, Rodriguez and Murphy exchanged nervous glances, while Chun stared straight ahead with the kind of rigid attention that comes from trying to maintain composure while your world crumbles around you. General Mitchell stopped pacing and fixed her gaze on Torres. "Staff Sergeant Torres, you seem to be the senior man in this group. Perhaps you could enlighten me about your conversation topics at Murphy's Tavern last evening." Torres's mind raced as he tried to formulate a response that might somehow minimize the damage. The general's calm demeanor was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. It suggested a level of control and calculation that promised serious consequences. "Ma'am, we were just having some drinks and talking," Torres stammered, immediately realizing how inadequate his response sounded. "Nothing serious, just blowing off steam after duty hours." "Blowing off steam," General Mitchell repeated, her tone remaining neutral. "An interesting phrase. Tell me, Staff Sergeant, do you believe that blowing off steam includes discussing how you would laugh in the face of a female general and questioning her ability to make command decisions?" The words hit Torres like a physical blow. There was no ambiguity now. She had heard everything. Every inappropriate joke, every disrespectful comment, every moment of unprofessional behavior had been witnessed by the very person they had been unknowingly insulting. "Ma'am, I wouldn't know," Torres began, but General Mitchell raised her hand to silence him. "You didn't know that your commanding general might be a woman? Or you didn't know that your conversation could be overheard? Help me understand what exactly you didn't know, Staff Sergeant." The question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to expose the fundamental flaw in any excuse Torres might attempt to offer. Whether they knew her identity or not was irrelevant. Their comments had revealed attitudes and beliefs that were incompatible with military professionalism and the values of the Marine Corps. Chun cleared her throat nervously. "General Mitchell, ma'am, we were completely out of line. There's no excuse for our behavior, and we accept full responsibility for our actions." General Mitchell turned her attention to Chun, and Torres could see a flicker of particular disappointment in the general's eyes. "Sergeant Chun, I'm especially interested in your perspective. As one of the few women at that table, how do you justify participating in and encouraging conversation that demeaned female service members?" Chen's composure finally cracked, and Torres could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. Ma'am, I was trying to fit in. I thought if I agreed with them, if I showed that I was different from other women, that I would be more accepted. I realize now how wrong that was. Trying to fit in, General Mitchell mused, returning to her position at the head of the table. Do you understand what message that sends to other female Marines in your unit? When they see a female sergeant participating in conversations that diminish their worth and capabilities? The question hung in the air, unanswered because there was no good answer. Chen's participation in the previous evening's conversation had indeed sent a message that even women in the military didn't believe women belonged there, that the toxic attitudes were not only tolerated but endorsed by those they affected most directly. General Mitchell activated a tablet that had been lying on the conference table, and Torres noticed her scrolling through what appeared to be detailed files. Let me share some information about your commanding general, about me, that might provide some context for this conversation. She began reading from the tablet, her voice taking on the formal tone of an official briefing. General Sarah Mitchell, commissioned as a second lieutenant 22 years ago. First woman in Marine Corps history to lead a combat engineering unit in active combat operations. Recipient of the Bronze Star with Combat V, the Purple Heart, and the Defense Superior Service Medal. Architect of the strategic innovations that reduced casualty rates in urban combat operations by 37%. Torres felt each accomplishment like a weight settling on his chest. This wasn't just some woman who had been promoted for political reasons. This was a warrior whose combat record and strategic brilliance had literally saved lives. Combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, General Mitchell continued, led the successful evacuation of civilian personnel during the embassy crisis in 2019, developed the counterinsurgency tactics that are now standard operating procedure throughout the Marine Corps, published author of 3 books on military strategy that are required reading at the War College. She set the tablet down and looked directly at each Marine in turn. Master's degree from Georgetown University in International Relations, completed while serving as a battalion commander. PhD in Strategic Studies from the Naval War College, completed during her tenure as a regimental commander. Speaks fluent Arabic, Farsi, and Mandarin Chinese. Williams looked physically ill at this point, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The young corporal who had joked about laughing in a female general's face was now confronted with the reality of exactly who he had been mocking, a combat veteran whose intellectual and military achievements exceeded anything he could hope to accomplish in several lifetimes. But, perhaps most relevant to last evening's conversation, General Mitchell continued, I am the architect of the current diversity and inclusion initiatives that you seem to find so objectionable. These programs exist not because of political pressure or social experimentation, but because diverse units perform better in combat. This isn't opinion. It's measurable facts supported by extensive research and real-world results. She moved to the wall where several military maps were displayed, pointing to various marked locations. Every one of these successful operations involve units with significant female participation. The intelligence gathering, the cultural sensitivity, the tactical innovations, all enhanced by having diverse perspectives and capabilities. Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Ma'am, we had no idea. We were completely wrong about everything. You had no idea, General Mitchell agreed. But that's exactly the problem, isn't it, Private Rodriguez? You made assumptions based on prejudice rather than facts. You dismissed the capabilities and contributions of female service members without bothering to examine the evidence. She returned to her position at the head of the table, her commanding presence filling the room. Let me tell you what I observed last evening. I saw 5 Marines who have forgotten what it means to be part of a team. I saw individuals who have allowed personal prejudices to override their professional judgment. Most concerning of all, I saw leaders who are actively undermining unit cohesion and effectiveness. Torres knew that whatever came next would determine the trajectory of all their careers. Courts-martial, administrative punishment, discharge, all possibilities that seemed increasingly likely as the meeting continued. The question now, General Mitchell said, settling into her chair at the head of the table, is what we're going to do about this situation. Each of you has a choice to make about who you want to be as Marines and as human beings. She leaned forward slightly, her intense gaze moving from one Marine to another. You can continue down the path you've been on, allowing prejudice and ignorance to guide your actions and attitudes. Or you can choose to grow, to learn, and to become the kind of leaders that the Marine Corps and your fellow Marines deserve. Murphy, who had been silent throughout the entire meeting, finally spoke up. Ma'am, what happens to us now? General Mitchell smiled slightly, though there was no warmth in the expression. That, Lance Corporal Murphy, depends entirely on what you do in the coming weeks and months. Consider this meeting the beginning of your education, not the end of your careers. She stood up from her chair, signaling that the formal portion of the meeting was concluding. You will each be assigned to special projects that will give you direct experience working with and learning from the female Marines you've been so quick to dismiss. You will also be required to attend extensive training on leadership, diversity, and military ethics. Torres felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They weren't being immediately court-martialed or discharged, but the general's tone suggested that their real challenges were just beginning. Furthermore, General Mitchell continued, you will be rotated through different units and assignments that will expose you to the full spectrum of capabilities within our modern Marine Corps. You will see firsthand why diversity and inclusion aren't social experiments. They're military necessities. She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to face the 5 Marines. One final thought. The woman you saw at Murphy's Tavern last evening, the one you dismissed as insignificant and invisible, that woman has commanded units larger than most people can imagine. She has made life and death decisions that affected thousands of Marines and their families. She has earned the respect and trust of senior military and civilian leaders around the world. Her voice took on a harder edge. That woman is your commanding general, and she will be watching your progress very closely from now on. I suggest you use this opportunity wisely. As General Mitchell left the conference room, the 5 Marines remained seated in stunned silence, each processing the magnitude of what had just occurred and what it meant for their futures in the Marine Corps. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in Conference Room Alpha, and Staff Sergeant Torres was beginning to understand that General Mitchell's idea of education was both comprehensive and relentless. His new assignment had placed him directly under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Washington, a combat veteran whose reputation for excellence was matched only by her intolerance for mediocrity. Torres found himself at the Camp Pendleton training facility at 0500 hours, watching as Lieutenant Colonel Washington conducted a pre-dawn briefing for the combined arms exercise that would dominate the next 72 hours. The exercise involved coordination between Marine infantry, aviation, artillery, and logistics units, a complex operation that required the kind of strategic thinking and tactical precision that Torres was only beginning to appreciate. The objective is simple, Lieutenant Colonel Washington explained to the assembled officers and senior non-commissioned officers. We have a simulated urban environment with multiple civilian populations, potential insurgent activity, and limited intelligence. Your job is to secure the area, identify threats, and establish lasting stability while minimizing collateral damage. Torres studied the lieutenant colonel as she outlined the exercise parameters. Patricia Washington was in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of weathered features that spoke to years of field experience. Her uniform bore the ribbons of multiple combat deployments, and her confident demeanor suggested someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. What struck Torres most was how naturally the other officers and NCOs deferred to her expertise. There was no hesitation, no questioning of her authority, no subtle undermining that he had observed in other mixed-gender leadership situations. Her competence was simply accepted as fact by everyone present. Staff Sergeant Torres, Lieutenant Colonel Washington called out, drawing his attention back to the briefing. You'll be working with Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos on intelligence coordination. Your job is to establish and maintain communication with local civilian leaders while identifying potential security threats. Torres nodded, though he felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. Gunnery Sergeant Santos was another woman, a pattern he was beginning to recognize in his new assignments. General Mitchell was clearly ensuring that he worked closely with exactly the kind of female Marines he had previously dismissed. As the briefing concluded and the various teams dispersed to their initial positions, Torres found himself walking alongside Gunnery Sergeant Santos toward their assigned observation post. She was a compact woman in her mid-30s with intense dark eyes and the kind of alert energy that suggested constant awareness of her surroundings. "So you're one of General Mitchell's special projects," Santos said without preamble as they navigated the rough terrain toward their position. There was no judgment in her voice, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of his situation. Torres felt heat rise in his face. "I guess that's one way to put it, Gunnery Sergeant. She's giving you a chance to learn something," Santos continued, adjusting the radio equipment slung across her shoulder. "The question is whether you're smart enough to take advantage of it." They reached their observation post, a carefully camouflaged position overlooking the simulated urban area where the exercise would take place. Santos immediately began setting up communication equipment with the efficient movements of someone who had performed these tasks hundreds of times in real combat situations. "Tell me about your intelligence experience," Santos said as she calibrated the radio frequencies. "Honestly, not much," Torres admitted. "Most of my career has been in basic infantry operations. Some reconnaissance work, but nothing like this level of complexity." Santos nodded as she completed her equipment setup. "Intelligence work isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being smart, patient, and observant. It's about understanding people and situations in ways that can't be taught in basic training." Over the next several hours, Torres watched Santos work with growing amazement. She seemed to effortlessly coordinate information from multiple sources: field reports from reconnaissance teams, intercepted communications, aerial surveillance data, and direct observation. More importantly, she was able to synthesize all of this disparate information into actionable intelligence that helped guide tactical decisions. "See that building complex at grid reference 74 Alpha?" Santos asked, pointing toward a cluster of structures in the distance while simultaneously monitoring 3 different radio channels. Torres studied the area through his binoculars, but saw nothing unusual. "Looks like standard civilian housing to me, Gunnery Sergeant." "Look again," Santos instructed. "Notice the pattern of foot traffic around the perimeter. See how the civilian actors are avoiding certain pathways? And check the window configurations. Some of those have been modified for better defensive positions." As Torres looked more carefully, the pattern Santos had identified became clear. What had initially appeared to be random civilian activity was actually a carefully orchestrated simulation of insurgent preparation for defensive operations. The detail she had noticed would be crucial for planning the assault phase of the exercise. "How did you see all that?" Torres asked, genuinely impressed. "Experience," Santos replied simply. 3 combat deployments in urban environments. You learn to read the signs because your life and the lives of your Marines depend on it." As the exercise continued, Torres found himself increasingly dependent on Santos's expertise and guidance. She seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened, identify weaknesses in friendly positions before they became problems, and coordinate with other units in ways that maximize their collective effectiveness. During a brief break in operations, Santos shared some of her background. She had grown up in a military family, enlisted immediately after high school, and had worked her way up through the intelligence specialization field through a combination of natural aptitude and relentless dedication to improvement. "The thing about intelligence work," Santos explained as they share rations while monitoring the radio traffic, "is that it requires a different kind of thinking than traditional combat operations. You can't muscle your way through problems. You have to be subtle, analytical, and willing to consider multiple perspectives." Torres was beginning to understand why General Mitchell had assigned him to this particular unit. His previous approach to military problems had been straightforward and conventional: apply force, follow established procedures, rely on traditional command structures. But modern military operations required the kind of flexible thinking and collaborative approach that Santos demonstrated naturally. Meanwhile, across the base, Corporal Williams was having his own educational experience. He had been assigned to a female Marine pilot, Captain Jennifer Liu, who was conducting advanced flight training operations. Williams had never given much thought to aviation operations, assuming that his infantry background made him superior to what he viewed as the more technical and less combative aspects of military service. Captain Liu was a graduate of the Naval Academy who had earned her wings through one of the most demanding training programs in the military. Her flight record included multiple combat missions in support of ground operations, and her technical expertise with the advanced systems aboard modern military aircraft was formidable. "Your job," Captain Liu explained as Williams struggled into the cramped observer seat of her aircraft, is to coordinate between air and ground operations. You need to understand both perspectives if you're going to be effective in joint operations. The flight began with basic orientation, but quickly progressed to complex tactical scenarios that required split-second decision-making and constant communication with multiple ground units. Williams found himself overwhelmed by the speed and complexity of modern air support operations. Captain Liu seemed to manage dozens of variables simultaneously: aircraft performance, weather conditions, ground unit positions, enemy threats, ammunition loads, fuel consumption, and communication with higher headquarters. She made it look effortless, but Williams was beginning to appreciate the years of training and experience required to develop such capabilities. Combat aviation isn't about individual heroics, Captain Liu explained during a brief break between training scenarios. It's about precise coordination with ground forces to provide exactly the right kind of support at exactly the right moment. One mistake, and you can end up hitting your own people instead of the enemy. Williams watched her work through a particularly complex scenario involving close air support for an embattled infantry unit. She had to consider the positions of friendly forces, the location of civilian populations, the capabilities of her weapon systems, and the ever-changing tactical situation on the ground. The level of responsibility and technical expertise required was far beyond anything Williams had previously imagined. Back in the administrative offices, Private Rodriguez was working under the supervision of Major Angela Foster, a logistics specialist whose job involved coordinating the movement of personnel, equipment, and supplies for the entire training exercise. Rodriguez had always viewed logistics as boring support work, something that happened in the background while real Marines did the important fighting. Major Foster quickly disabused him of that notion. Logistics is what makes combat operations possible, she explained as she guided Rodriguez through the complex planning process for the exercise. Every bullet fired, every gallon of fuel consumed, every meal eaten by every Marine has to be anticipated, procured, transported, and distributed. The scope of the operation was staggering. Major Foster was simultaneously managing supply convoys, coordinating with multiple civilian contractors, scheduling aircraft for transport operations, maintaining equipment inventories, and planning for contingencies that Rodriguez had never considered. "See the spreadsheet?" Major Foster asked, pointing to a complex document displayed on her computer screen. "This tracks the ammunition consumption for every unit in the exercise. If I miscalculate by even 10%, some Marines might run out of ammunition during a critical phase of the operation." Rodriguez stared at the screen, full of numbers and calculations, beginning to understand that successful military operations required far more than just courage and fighting spirit. The mathematical precision and forward thinking required for effective logistics was a form of expertise that he had never considered or appreciated. Lance Corporal Murphy was experiencing his own revelation while working with Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres, no relation to his colleague, in the military police unit responsible for security and civilian interaction during the exercise. Murphy had always viewed military police work as essentially civilian law enforcement with uniforms, but Staff Sergeant Torres was showing him a much more complex reality. Military police in combat zones have to understand local customs, speak at least basic phrases in local languages, identify potential security threats, coordinate with civilian authorities, and maintain order without escalating tensions, Staff Sergeant Torres explained as they practiced riot control techniques with simulated civilian protesters. The role-playing exercise was intense and realistic, with civilian actors portraying various scenarios that military police might encounter in real deployments. Staff Sergeant Torres demonstrated remarkable skill in de-escalating tense situations through a combination of cultural sensitivity, tactical awareness, and interpersonal communication skills. Murphy found himself struggling with scenarios that Staff Sergeant Torres handled with apparent ease. His instinct was to rely on authority and force to resolve conflicts, but she showed him more subtle approaches that achieved better results while minimizing the risk of creating larger problems. "The goal isn't to win every confrontation," Staff Sergeant Torres explained after Murphy had bungled a particularly sensitive interaction with simulated civilian leaders. "The goal is to accomplish the mission while building the kind of relationships that support long-term stability and cooperation." Sergeant Shun, meanwhile, was working with Colonel Maria Gonzalez in the command post, observing how senior female officers managed complex operations involving hundreds of personnel and multiple moving parts. Colonel Gonzalez was simultaneously coordinating with higher headquarters, monitoring the progress of various exercise components, and making strategic decisions that affected the entire operation. What impressed Chin most was how Colonel Gonzalez managed to maintain awareness of both the big picture and the crucial details. She could discuss strategic objectives with general officers while also ensuring that individual Marines had the resources and support they needed to accomplish their specific tasks. Leadership at this level isn't about being the toughest or the loudest, Colonel Gonzalez explained during a brief break between briefings. It's about creating an environment where everyone can perform at their highest level while working toward common objectives. Chun watched as Colonel Gonzalez handled a complex problem involving competing resource requirements from multiple units. Rather than simply making an executive decision, she brought together the relevant personnel to discuss options and develop solutions that met everyone's core needs while supporting the overall mission. As the training exercise continued, all 5 Marines began to understand that their previous assumptions about women in the military had been based on ignorance rather than evidence. They were working with female Marines whose expertise, dedication, and effectiveness clearly exceeded their own in virtually every meaningful measure. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening at Murphy's Tavern, and the conference room where the 5 Marines now sat bore little resemblance to the sterile, intimidating space where General Mitchell had first confronted them with their failures. Today, the same room hosted a very different kind of meeting, a progress review that would determine not only their immediate futures, but also serve as a testament to the power of education, humility, and genuine personal growth. General Mitchell sat at the head of the table once again, but the atmosphere was markedly different. Instead of the tense silence that had characterized their first encounter, there was an air of mutual respect and professional accomplishment that spoke to the transformation that had taken place over the preceding months. Staff Sergeant Torres, who had once dismissed the idea of female leadership, now carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to appreciate expertise regardless of its source. His assignment with Lieutenant Colonel Washington and Gunnery Sergeant Santos had fundamentally changed his understanding of what effective military leadership looked like. The swagger and bravado that had once defined his approach had been replaced by genuine competence and hard-earned wisdom. Staff Sergeant Torres, General Mitchell began, Lieutenant Colonel Washington speaks very highly of your progress in intelligence operations. Would you care to share what you've learned during your assignment? Torres sat up straighter, his response measured and thoughtful. Ma'am, I learned that my previous understanding of military effectiveness was embarrassingly limited. Working with Gunnery Sergeant Santos showed me that real strength comes from competence, not attitude. The intelligence work we conducted quite literally saved lives during the training exercises, and it was her expertise that made that possible. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. I also learned that the diversity initiatives I once criticized aren't about politics or social engineering. They're about operational effectiveness. The different perspectives and skills that diverse units bring to complex problems create better solutions than any homogeneous group could achieve. General Mitchell nodded approvingly. And how has this changed your approach to leadership? Ma'am, I now understand that my job as a leader is to create an environment where every Marine can contribute their unique strengths to accomplish the mission. That means checking my own prejudices and assumptions and being willing to learn from anyone who has something valuable to teach. Corporal Williams, who had once joked about laughing in a female general's face, now understood the profound irony of that comment. His time with Captain Liu had opened his eyes to the complexity and responsibility of modern military operations. The technical expertise required to coordinate air and ground operations safely and effectively had humbled him in ways that traditional infantry training never could. Corporal Williams, General Mitchell continued, Captain Liu reports that you've requested additional training in joint operations coordination. What motivated that decision? Williams smiled slightly, an expression that reflected genuine enthusiasm rather than his former cockiness. Ma'am, watching Captain Liu work showed me how much I didn't know about modern warfare. The level of technical knowledge, spatial awareness, and quick decision-making required for combat aviation is incredible. I realized that if I wanted to be an effective leader, I needed to understand all aspects of military operations, not just my own narrow specialty. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gaining intensity as he spoke about his newfound passion. The precision required to provide close air support without endangering friendly forces is something that requires years of training and constant practice. Captain Liu made it look easy, but I learned that behind that apparent effortlessness was extraordinary competence and dedication. Private Rodriguez had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation of the group. His work with Major Foster in logistics had completely changed his understanding of what military service meant. The young Marine who had once dismissed support operations as less important than combat roles now understood that without effective logistics, combat operations simply couldn't happen. Private Rodriguez, General Mitchell said, Major Foster tells me you've been accepted for advanced logistics training. That's quite an achievement for someone at your rank and experience level. Rodriguez beamed with pride, though his enthusiasm was tempered by humility. Ma'am, Major Foster taught me that logistics is the backbone of everything we do. Every successful mission depends on hundreds of decisions and calculations that most Marines never see or think about. I want to be part of that. I want to contribute to mission success in a meaningful way. He gestured expressively as he continued. I used to think that the only way to serve honorably was in direct combat roles. Now I understand that every Marine who contributes to mission success is serving honorably, regardless of their specific job or background. Lance Corporal Murphy's experience with Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres in military police operations had shown him the importance of cultural sensitivity and interpersonal skills in modern military operations. The young Marine who had once relied purely on authority and intimidation had learned to appreciate the subtle skills required for effective peacekeeping and civilian interaction. Lance Corporal Murphy, General Mitchell addressed him, Staff Sergeant Torres reports significant improvement in your communication and conflict resolution skills. How do you plan to apply these abilities in your future assignments? Murphy straightened in his chair, his response reflecting careful thought and genuine commitment. Ma'am, I learned that real authority comes from competence and respect, not from intimidation or force. Staff Sergeant Torres showed me that solving problems diplomatically often achieves better long-term results than trying to dominate every situation. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I also learned that understanding different perspectives and cultural backgrounds isn't just politically correct, it's tactically essential. When you're working with civilian populations or allied forces, your ability to communicate effectively and build trust can determine mission success or failure. Sergeant Chin's transformation had been perhaps the most complex of the group, as she had to confront not only her prejudices about others, but also her own internalized beliefs about her worth and capabilities as a female Marine. Her time with Colonel Gonzalez had shown her what female leadership could accomplish when supported by competence, confidence, and institutional backing. Sergeant Chun, General Mitchell said, her tone carrying particular warmth, Colonel Gonzalez has recommended you for advanced leadership training. She believes you have significant potential for senior, non-commissioned officer positions. How do you feel about that recommendation? Chin's response reflected a newfound confidence that had been entirely absent 6 months earlier. Ma'am, working with Colonel Gonzalez taught me that I have been limiting myself based on other people's expectations rather than my own capabilities. I learned that seeking acceptance by diminishing other women was not only wrong, but also self-destructive. She looked directly at General Mitchell as she continued. I now understand that my responsibility is to be the best Marine I can be and to help other Marines, both male and female, achieve their full potential. Colonel Gonzalez showed me what that looks like in practice. General Mitchell allowed a moment of silence as she studied each of the 5 Marines. The transformation was evident not just in their words, but in their bearing, their confidence, and their obvious commitment to growth and improvement. These were no longer the bitter, prejudiced individuals who had mocked female leadership in a bar 6 months ago. Each of you has exceeded my expectations, General Mitchell said finally. When I first confronted you about your behavior and attitudes, I wasn't certain that you were capable of the kind of fundamental change that would be required. You have proven me wrong in the best possible way. She stood and moved to the window overlooking the parade grounds, where Marines of all backgrounds were conducting their daily training exercises in perfect coordination. The Marine Corps is stronger today because of your growth and development. You have become the kind of leaders that your fellow Marines deserve. Leaders who judge others based on competence and character rather than demographics or stereotypes. Turning back to face the group, General Mitchell's expression reflected both satisfaction and continuing expectation. However, your education is far from complete. Leadership is a lifelong learning process, and the Marine Corps will continue to challenge you in ways that require growth and adaptation. Torres raised his hand slightly. Ma'am, permission to speak freely? Granted, Staff Sergeant. Ma'am, I want to apologize not just for what we said that evening, but for the attitudes and beliefs that made those comments possible. We were wrong about women in the military, but more fundamentally, we were wrong about what military service means and what makes someone worthy of respect. The other 4 Marines nodded in agreement, their expressions reflecting genuine remorse and commitment to change. William spoke up next. Ma'am, we all learned that our assumptions were based on ignorance rather than evidence. The female Marines we worked with weren't just competent. They were often more skilled and experienced than we were. Rodriguez added his own reflection. Ma'am, I understand now that diversity isn't about fairness or politics. It's about assembling the best possible team to accomplish the mission. When you exclude capable people based on prejudice, you make your unit weaker. Murphy nodded emphatically. Ma'am, we learned that real strength comes from working together effectively, not from trying to prove you're better than everyone else. Chun concluded the group's collective apology. Ma'am, I learned that supporting other women doesn't make me weaker. It makes all of us stronger. I'm committed to being part of the solution rather than part of the problem. General Mitchell returned to her seat, her expression reflecting both satisfaction and ongoing expectation. Your apologies are accepted, but more importantly, your actions over the past 6 months demonstrate genuine commitment to change. That matters more than words. She opened a folder that had been lying on the table. Based on your performance and growth during this period, you will all be receiving new assignments that reflect your expanded capabilities and understanding. These positions will give you opportunities to apply what you've learned while continuing to grow as leaders. Torres would be assigned to a joint training unit where he would work with personnel from all branches of the military, including significant numbers of female officers and NCOs. His intelligence experience would be valuable, but more importantly, his changed attitudes would help create a more positive and effective working environment. Williams would receive additional training in joint operations before being assigned to a unit that regularly coordinated with aviation assets. His newfound appreciation for the complexity of modern military operations would serve him well in positions of increased responsibility. Rodriguez would attend the advanced logistics school he had requested, with a follow-on assignment to a unit supporting humanitarian operations overseas. His understanding of the importance of support operations would be crucial in missions where logistical effectiveness could mean the difference between success and failure. Murphy would receive advanced training in military police operations with an emphasis on cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution. His improved interpersonal skills would be valuable in assignments involving civilian populations and allied forces. Chun would attend the leadership development course that Colonel Gonzalez had recommended, preparing her for positions of increased responsibility where her example could influence other Marines. These assignments represent opportunities, General Mitchell explained, but they also represent responsibilities. You will be in positions where your attitudes and behaviors will influence other Marines. The growth you've achieved over the past 6 months must continue, and you must help create the kind of environment where all Marines can succeed regardless of their background. As the meeting drew to a close, General Mitchell offered one final observation. 6 months ago, you were part of the problem. Today, you have the opportunity to be part of the solution. The Marine Corps and your fellow Marines are counting on you to continue growing, learning, and leading by example. The 5 Marines stood and saluted as General Mitchell dismissed them, but the formality was tempered by mutual respect and shared commitment to the values and mission of the Marine Corps. As they filed out of the conference room, each carried with them not only new assignments and opportunities, but also a transformed understanding of what it meant to serve with honor and integrity. Outside the headquarters building, the 5 Marines paused to reflect on their journey. The swagger and false bravado that had once characterized their interactions had been replaced by genuine confidence based on competence and growth. They had learned that true strength came not from diminishing others, but from building them up. That diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness, and That leadership required humility as much as courage. Torres looked back at the building where General Mitchell continued her work of leading thousands of Marines with distinction and honor. He said quietly, 6 months ago, I thought I knew what leadership looked like. I was completely wrong. Williams nodded in agreement. She could have ended our careers that day. Instead, she gave us the chance to become better Marines and better people. As they walked across the base toward their respective duties, the 5 Marines carried with them the knowledge that transformation was possible, that growth required humility and effort, and that the Marine Corps was stronger when it embraced the full potential of all its members. Their journey from prejudice to understanding, from ignorance to competence, and from part of the problem to part of the solution would continue to influence their careers and the lives of the Marines they would lead in years to come. The evening sun cast long shadows across the parade grounds as another day of training and preparation came to an end, but for these 5 Marines, their real education was just beginning.